Okay, hi everyone. Just starting the meeting and letting all of the attendees in. We have got quite a few on this call today, so I'll just give it a few minutes while everyone joins, and then we'll begin. Okay, you can see the number increasing now as we just go over to the 1 minute mark. So I'll just leave it a few more seconds just to get everybody in, and then we'll take a look at the webinar presentation. Okay, so thanks for everyone who's joined already and those that are still joining. You're joining the webinar with Giant Screening, and we've got Trust ID with us, and this is all about identity verification and your first line of defence against the rise of identity fraud. So I'll just go through some quick introductions just as we're getting started with everyone in. I'm Kelly Pugh, I'm the Head of Product here at Giant. I'm going to talk you through in this webinar session some of the ways in which we're using this technology. That comes towards the end, and we're really pleased to have Tony with us today. So thanks to Tony to talk to us about Trust ID and a broader look at the identity verification fraud outside of the services that we're going to show you. So I'll run through the agenda quickly. Like I said, Tony's going to talk to us about identity fraud crisis in the UK. We're going to look at some trends in some of the fraudulent identity documents across across the world in global real world consequences. And then I'll start to talk more about identity verification for Giant, what that means to us. I know we've got some of our lovely customers here on the call today, but we've also got others that are maybe learning about Giant for the first time or interested in how identity verification works for us. So we'll take a look at that towards the end, and then we'll have hopefully some time for some questions. We will stop towards the end. Anything that you want to ask throughout, pop it into the chat. I'm going to take a look at those throughout Tony's presentation, and then we'll get some of the best answers out towards the end. Just as a bit of housekeeping, what I'll do is I'll just put a reaction on any questions that we have answered or will answer. All questions will be answered at some point, and we'll come back to that and send out some information based on what we get. Okay, so just to start by talking about us and Giant, obviously we're here to talk about identity fraud within the screening service. Just to call out, obviously we do provide screening services globally, and we will touch on some of those as we go through the presentation, but we're primarily here, like we said, to talk about how ID verification works for us within the host of screening services that we do provide. And then over to you, Tony, just to give you a little introduction about Trust ID, and then obviously into what we're here to talk about.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Tony Machin, Chief Exec at Trust ID. So a few words about us as an organisation. Some of you may have heard of us before, but we're one of the, well, probably the leading IDSP when it comes to right to work and DBS, digital identity checks in the UK. You can see we do other things, right to rent and KYCML checks, but obviously today we're going to concentrate an awful lot about how fraudulent documents, identity fraud affects onboarding particularly. We've been a certified IDSP with a third one certified back in 2022, but not only have we seen therefore fraud trends since that change, we've obviously been doing right to work checks since back into 2017. We launched our first cloud service for right to work, and we've seen therefore how the trend in identity crime has evolved as we've gone through things like Brexit and digital schemes, and I'll touch a little bit on that later on. Interestingly, obviously, I'm talking here about quite an important subject. So in terms of credibility, not only do we, obviously says we've got 3,200 public and private sector organisations, but in the public sector, we work with the police, We do right to work checks for central government. I think Home Office is a client of ours. We've just started working with National Crime Agency. So in terms of our knowledge, and part of that is the intelligence sharing that we've provided over the years. So as an organisation, we have an intelligence sharing agreement with the Police Amber Hill team, which is the team looking after counterfeit, fraudulently obtained genuine documents. We've done intelligence sharing with the Home Office, with immigration enforcement, etc. So we have quite a lot of data around how trends in fake and counterfeit and identity verification have moved. The rest of that kind of speaks for itself, apart from that bottom bullet point, I think I should just allude on. So IDVT, identity validation technology, is very good. It's very robust. It's getting better and better. But obviously you don't know what you don't know on technology. And so we have also always backed up our systems with human in the loop, or human expert analysis. So we're a software and human. A lot of it is just software, but at some points, humans do need to get involved, either because it's not clear what the software decision is made, or people specifically want us to do that, or anything that is actually flagged as suspicious, we will always double check with a human just to make sure it's 100% right. So yeah, that's a bit about us. So we're obviously here to talk about identity fraud, and identity fraud in itself is a huge subject, and clearly there's some really good stats on there that have been put on. But ultimately, if you just think about it in simplicity, probably an enabler of all crime is an identity, a fake or counterfeit identity. So in terms of employee onboarding, which is kind of what most people are relevant for, yes, you've got the protection against right to work legislation and the fines that will come with that, but also not knowing who you're employing leads to crime, because actually that person could be specifically targeting a construction company to get on that site, and the next day the whole container of tools has disappeared. I've seen that happen. We've had and been involved with instances with healthcare professionals who are not qualified working illegally, and obviously the damage that could cause. We've been involved with people who've used counterfeit documents to get into local authorities and housing associations, allocating housing illegally. It enables a lot more crime than just a crime of working illegally. So actually, from our perspective, understanding who it is you are employing is always going to, at least in terms of checking their identity as robustly as you can, it's not only preventing you in terms of getting falling foul of the regulation around right to work and DBS, but it's also protecting your organisation about other potential crime. And it's interesting, I did an article many years ago for a well-known newspaper, and they were asking me about this, and they said, well, we don't hear about kind of company crime related to identity. I said, well, it's not the kind of thing everybody goes shouting around, because it's not good for clients, it's not good for shareholders, it doesn't give confidence. So it's one of those things that's not often talked about. But you can see from the numbers there, it's a big issue. And, right at the outset, let's at least know who we're employing. So if we move on to the next slide, what are we seeing? Now, I talked earlier about trends. So if I'd shown you this graph 3 years ago, it would look very different. And that's because in terms of the main documents that we find, given what we do as a majority of our business is related to employee onboarding in some description, is you will have seen 3 years ago that the number of ID cards would have been much bigger, because in that time, of course, you could use European identity cards as a proof of right to work. Since Brexit and that being removed, we then saw a big switch to BRP cards. They were then stopped being allowed as evidence for right to work in 2023, so they've tailed off. And so what we're now seeing is very much a rise of passports, mainly British. It was counterfeit documents, and also the ID cards is still there. But as you'll see on the next slide, you'll see that the kind of nationality has changed. So you can see here that actually Ireland was not even on our top 10. And over the last 18 months has come from nowhere to now being a serious threat. So if you are seeing particularly Irish passport cards, every Irish passport card that comes to our business, we check with a human now. They're that prevalent, so that's what we do. So going back to this, BRP cards, by the way, so if you just go back to that previous slide, because I didn't care. BRP cards, I know they're not allowed for right to work. They are still, and they are stopped being produced, but they are still in circulation, and they are allowed to support a DBS check, not as a primary document, as a secondary document. So we are still seeing fake BRPs. And obviously driving licenses, because we're doing an awful lot more digital DBS now, we are seeing a big increase in driving licenses as well, who are being used as a supporting document in evidence for DBS checks. Visas have gone right down because obviously you're not seeing many kind of paper visas. So the message on here is people think, well, passports are really robust documents and they're really difficult to counterfeit. Well, we're still seeing an awful lot of them. And particularly, again, a warning shot for everybody, if people are not doing digital, where you have to have an in-date passport, there's an increase in people purporting to have out-of-date passports, which of course is a manual check, and they're assuming that on the manual check, nobody's going to look at them closely. So if we go back to the country split slide, please. So on here, again, I've talked about Great Britain and Ireland. So going back to what I said about the old European identity cards, they are still very much in circulation and obviously not allowed as evidence of right to work, but are being used elsewhere as an identity. And again, looking at DBS, that's an obvious one. So you might be doing a share code, might be using an imposter share code, which we'll come back to, and actually might be using a fake Portuguese ID card. And those three countries there, Portugal, Italy and France, have always been in the top five in terms of counterfeit documents, because obviously Portugal, particularly the South American link, and France very much the African link. So you're getting a lot of people who speak those languages but are not actually a true French or Portuguese nationality. Next one. Okay, I think this is the really interesting slide. So this is, since essentially digital schemes came in and were used widely. So you can see it goes back to October 2022. And this is essentially the rise of share code imposters. So people clearly getting other people's share codes. And we believe there is a trade almost happening now in this, where people are selling share codes to illegal workers. And obviously they're getting their share codes, that's the share code that's being inputted. But because we are taking selfies in the process, which we'll talk about later, we are actually being able to identify that the selfie of the applicant doesn't match the photograph on the share code. And that, as you can see, the stats speak for themselves. Now, alongside this, and we think this is really important for people to realise, but alongside this, we're also seeing quite an increase in imposters using genuine identity documents. So that's people using real British identity passports, for example, or Irish passport, maybe real documents, but actually they don't own the document. So imposter crime is very much on the increase, given that the digital schemes are more robust in detecting counterfeit documents. Next slide. So this is always the slide that we all get to. So that's the threat. That's what's happening. The threat is real. Every week we are seeing lots and lots of counterfeit documents and lots of imposters, and there's no particular sector. People say to me, it used to be quite clear pre-digital. It used to be fairly obviously construction, hospitality, facilities management, etc. That's much broader now, but still probably in the high turnover sectors, we're probably still seeing the majority. So clearly, the stats there in terms of business, it's obviously a big cost of business. And obviously, in terms of individual cases, the first fine, as you'll probably all know, is 45,000. Repeat fines is 60,000 per illegal. But it's not just the fine, which everybody used to obviously worry about because it was a civil penalty. Now it can be a criminal offence. So it was obviously strengthened in 2016. So there's the reputational damage, but not just the reputational damage in terms of having your name, or as happened to a well-known burger restaurant. They were all over the front pages of the newspapers, and how they dealt with it, and that didn't do the business any good at all. But also you're on the radar. You're on the radar of other government agencies. As soon as you've got an immigration enforcement action against you, that is shared again with HMRC and other organisations. So and of course now they have the right to close down sites and close down businesses while they continue to investigate other possible illegal working. So you really want to avoid it at all costs, because it could be massively disruptive as well as costing you fines. And then, of course, as I said at the end, we have seen many cases and have been involved in supporting prosecution of many cases that people have posed a risk by working illegally, whether that be in healthcare, whether it be in local authorities and things like that. So, it is something we all have, I suppose, a duty. And it's not very often I can say that I work in a business that actually, yes, it's a business, and we are here obviously to create value, but actually it's actually doing a very good and important role as well in terms of actually stopping crime. And whilst we're talking a lot here clearly about employee onboarding crime, and illegal working and what the consequences of that, we also work in other areas where we're detecting fake counterfeit documents and imposters, trying to buy cars and other things. So, it is very widespread as per some of the slides. So that's me. I hope that's been interesting, and I'll hand back over to Kelly.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you. Yeah, so just to talk about now some of the key elements that we were looking at on our last slide and sort of bringing them to life from a screening perspective. And that was really interesting for us as well to look at all of the trends that we're seeing outside of screening. It's all very relevant. But just to bring it back to it for a giant perspective. So digital checks and ID validation is such a crucial screening component. Before we do anything, it all has to be based off an accurate identity verification, and just to make sure that all of the checks that follow are correct and accurate, and that we're ensuring the integrity of that screening process and the results. So it's really important that it's done as a crucial screening component up front. To talk about how we do that, we're going to concentrate on our digital right to work checks and digital DBS checks. Both of those are embedded within our candidate journey. So it's bringing them through that consistent journey from a candidate perspective, but it's offering our customers that instant result, the compliance element, and obviously the processing of these digital checks within a screening process. Not only are combating the fraud elements, which is, as we're alluding to, one of the most important parts, it's also helping speed up traditional processes that are sometimes not as efficient as they could be. It's removing the need for the employer to verify those original documents. So these are the two checks that we're going to concentrate on. And looking on to the next slide, a little bit more about how we use those checks and what it means for our customers and the types of services that we're now providing. So I think the first and the main thing for us is that it's a more inclusive digital journey for all nationalities. When we're saying that 2 years ago, the launch of IDVT, it's great, offering a more compliant and modernised process for UK and Irish candidates to come through and provide their ID digitally. And that's now being seen when we're offering that compliance element for in the more consistent way through the screening process on the share code checks. So with the Home Office share code integration, it means that all nationalities are coming through our candidate experience, going into the digital journey, providing their information securely. And of course, the facial verification, as Tony mentioned earlier, that's across all journeys. So you're still getting that level of compliance. And this time that facial verification is working against the output in the Home Office share code check to make sure that there's no fraudulent elements within that search. So that's a bit about how we use it. Obviously, it's great for our processes, and if any of our giant customers on the call today, obviously you'll know that with this comes the instant results and the instant alert and escalation of those checks that maybe don't meet the requirements, or those checks that maybe need another compliance look before they go through to the rest of the recruitment process. So we're seeing a big impact. I know, Tony, you see the slide that we looked at. It's the more prevalent part of the fraud checks that you're seeing as well. And I know that you're keen to sort of maybe look at this a little bit more before we go into some questions, as to what this means within a screening process.
Yeah, and I think this is really important, the way that Giant have brought this together into one kind of service, because pre the digital scheme, UK and Irish, the e-visa scheme, the share code scheme existed, but obviously it was requiring employers to go directly in, bring back the report, and check it against the person in front of them, which is not always the easiest things to do, and can be quite uncomfortable. Whereas here, because of the technology that we as an IDSP, and we were doing this prior to the digital scheme, overlaying that facial biometric test, it makes it a lot easier. So now you've got this one digital service, because the Home Office is still talking about two services, the scheme and the digital e-visa scheme. That's all in one. It makes it a lot simpler. It's one journey. It's one app, if you want to call it that, and anybody can go through that, and it's very, very easy, very, very quick, and they say, and generally, unless there's an issue, very, very fast.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about this maybe as we answer some of the questions. So just to move on to the last slide, and then I'm going to take a look into the chat and also the questions section just to see if we've got anything yet. But if anybody does have any questions, we only seem to have one so far, which is, are the facial verifications the same as the ones offered by apps like Yoti, for example? So just to talk about, obviously, the accreditations there as an IDSP, and you might want to answer that a little bit further. My quick answer is yes, of course. And then back to the security of this process with you guys. So,
Yeah,
okay, so how do you go on?
I was going to say, because when that question, you don't need to compare. That's the great thing about certification. You don't need to compare these facial biometrics, these different technologies, and the different verification that different IDSPs may use, because we've all been certified. And if we've been certified, we meet the requirement for the facial biometrics, the liveness, the document liveness, the verification levels, all the things that are required of us as certified IDSPs. So the fact is, you go and choose a certified IDSP because we've all got the right verification technology. What you're then looking at is obviously more of the customer journey. How easy is it to use? How easy is it to deploy? What are the costs, etc., etc. But in terms of a comparison about facial biometrics, we all, inverted commas, do the same because we've all been certified.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question, how do you check a visa that is on an expired passport, but the person has already a new passport and they cannot generate a share code? So just for me to answer that from a giant perspective, those candidates that are in scope and do have a share code, obviously will provide that during the journey and that will be validated. Those that don't within our screening platform, they will be directed to upload additional documentation to meet the LISP requirements of the Home Office Guide to Right to Work checks. And then our processes will ensure that you get the alerts in order to do the face-to-face verification or the examination of the additional documents. So hopefully that answers that question. Tony, I'm not sure that would be one that falls in scope of the digital check process anyway. So great. I'm just going to make sure we've tied that one off. We've got another question here so far. My understanding was that with a share code, you still had to have a video call or face-to-face check. Is that not correct? So want to repeat that one?
Yeah, that is correct. So let's not confuse the two things. So obviously you are doing potentially your digital check pre-employment. So you might be doing it an hour before, a day before, and even a week before. What the imposter check, which they talk about, is on day one of employment, you must check that the report that was returned by the IDSP with the photograph and all the stuff that you expect, and says that's the right person, that is the person who turns up for work. That can either be done in person when they actually arrive at the office or the site, or it can be done by video. So that's the day one imposter check that is simply verifying that the person who turns up for work is the person for whom you have the IDSP verification report.
Thank you. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay,
by the way, Kelly, can I just add to that?
Yeah.
There is whilst that is a requirement clearly in the guidelines and the guidance, and you must do that check, there is actually no requirement for you to record that check. Okay, so you don't have to keep a recording of that video call that check the Trust ID giant verification against that. So you just have to do it. But
that's
some
just a
organisations
exercise in some cases. Yeah. Okay, great. No, thank you. Really important on the end there. Yeah, so hopefully that answers, and we'll follow up with a bit more information on these questions as well in a bit of a release afterwards. So the next question, any thoughts on how soon or the feasibility that there might be a portability of right to work check? For example, in some onboarding processes, the worker may find they are being checked by the agency and their payroll partners.
Do you want me to say that?
Yes, I think you can start. I mean, I've probably got something to say, but yeah, you as the expert there, and maybe with more knowledge in wider conversations on the feasibility and what the plans might look like.
Yeah, so the whole point of a reusable digital right to work check has been talked about. It's actually, there is a paragraph in the guidance set out but at the moment it just hasn't got. I mean, the interoperability. How does an employer access it? How do they validate it, and with what tokens? the Home Office haven't changed the legislation that still says you have to do a new check. Now that might be on a document, but that might be a reusable, but it's just way off being deployable. So there's a lot of talk about it, prompted by some organisations that are obviously very much driven by that. I think we are a long way off, and I think the first thing we might see is an organisation, a large organisation that clearly has a lot of employees, such as the NHS, for example. Maybe the first move is in trying to create digital reusable right to work checks. But I mean, we're still a couple of years off that even being properly tested in the NHS. There is a project ongoing, and I don't think that's in beta still, and is in beta for at least another 18 months. So I think we're still a long way off, but it will come eventually. I'm pretty certain of that.
Great. That was a really great question and really interesting. Okay, it sounds like that's a webinar for the future. So we'll probably come back to that one. Okay, to run through some of the rest of the questions, we've got two that's quite similar. So back to imposter checks, just to maybe answer some questions there. Are day one imposter checks conducted the same if the employee is a contractor or a permanent employee? And is it right that that needs to be completed prior or on arrival on the first day of everyone, regardless of their employment or contract status?
So it must be conducted on day one when they start work, essentially. So if you've done your right to work, your digital right to work check the day before, 2 hours before, a week before, a month before, when they actually start work, your first action must be to make sure that person, whether say remotely and you do it by video or in person, is the person that you did the check on. And in terms of the contractor, etc., it is the responsibility of whoever the employer is, whoever actually the name on the right to work check, the thing that you've got, they are the people responsible for making sure that imposter check. Now, if they delegate that down, say, as a staffing company to the site where the staff is, that's between them and the ultimate site. But ultimately, the employer is the one who is responsible.
Great, thank you, Tony. Okay, so that answers, I think there's a little bit more on another question regarding that we've just answered. So I'm going to go to the next one, which is, are we also verifying diplomas obtained outside the UK? So just to touch on that from a screening perspective, obviously dependent on the screening checks and the compliance requirements that we've got built in, probably if that forms part of any qualification verification. But just to bring this back to right to work and to maybe talk a bit more about the student verifications, Tony, and the way in which the student documents are captured for the time limited student visa. I don't think we touched on that really.
No, so a lot of the share codes are obviously going to be automated, very quick responses because they've got, the full continuous right to work, we want to call it that. However, when it comes to, there are time limitations on some visas, and then of course you've got the whole student population. And on the student population, they will take longer to come back because obviously what we're requiring on that in terms of that wizard, as soon as you say you're a student, when you do the share code option, it will ask you to upload evidence of term time. We will then check that evidence of term time and we will tell you whether it's appropriate or inappropriate. And if it's inappropriate, you will obviously have to go back to your student applicant and get them to do something different. So we are doing that check. We are checking not just the validity and the verification, i.e. matching the imposter and all the other stuff. We're actually now checking also for the students in particular and time limited or job limited, we are checking the eligibility and we're making that very clear on the report that comes back to you. So it's very clear, right? This student is a student, but they haven't got appropriate evidence of term time and you will need to go back and do something about that.
Great, yeah, that was something that I'm glad we touched on because it's something that we're seeing a lot of benefits from certain clients of ours that do high percentage of that population. So, okay, thank you to that. And we're going back to imposter checks again. So there's a few more questions. I think it's just we're giving such good advice, Tony, that we just want to get some clarification from you. So, to go back to imposter checks, by employer, would this be the end client within the contract market? And then we've got, can it not be completed a week before if someone is visiting us before the start date in the office face-to-face? So Tony advised that it must be on day one. However, as far as I'm concerned, this be completed prior. Just looking for clarification.
Well, it's your interpretation of the guidance. So the guidance is very clear that it is on day one of employment. So if somebody's come to visit you for a familiarisation, it is fairly obvious that somebody could send an imposter who looks like the person who's in the report. Because they're sophisticated, some of these guys, and it might be modern slavery, it could be a whole raft of things. The person who actually turns up to work to get paid the salary is why you need to make sure it is on day one, because they're the person you're going to sign off at day one, and you're going to start their time with you and earning money, and actually starts a contract of employment. It is all about when that contract of employment starts. So if your pre-visit is actually that also the start of employment, then you're fine to do it then. But the strict interpretation is the day they start work, not the day they come and visit you for familiarization. It is the day they start work, because the person who visits you may not be still the person who turns up for work a week later.
Okay, great. Sorry, I just interrupted the screen sharing, but okay, just to go back to the questions, let's have a look. Can you possibly talk about Trust ID's face-to-face check? Trust ID can verify ID documents in person and match the document holder to the person present. I think there's a quotation that's been provided there from maybe some guidance that's been put out about Trust ID, but I think, is this about the manual intervention check more than anything that we want to talk about here?
Yeah, so that's a slightly different service, and some of that. So we're obviously on today talking about digital checks because that's the main emphasis, and that's what Giant is providing. But we do provide a service that supports, because obviously not everybody can do a digital check. So if you've got an out-of-date British passport, or you've got no passport at all, and you've got a birth certificate and proof of NI, we do support that. But that's obviously something to talk to Giant about in terms of how we would facilitate that through the Giant platform. But as a service, it's something we do.
Brilliant, yeah. And just to sort of end that on the Giant side of things, so that is already something that we can offer if there is a more compliant check that's needed in conjunction with the face-to-face verifications. And quite a lot of our customers actually do that. So if we're telling you that the digital check has not met the requirements, we can then initiate another check, another data check in the background to make sure that your face-to-face check is as compliant as it can be, in a very similar way actually to the way that is happening on the share code check, to make sure that that's the most compliant check that it can be. Okay, so I think we haven't got any more questions in the chat. I'm looking at the time. We're only at half an hour, which is halfway through, but I think that we've covered everything. Unless there's any more questions from everybody, we might just make this more of a just over 30-minute webinar and really go through these questions and provide, like I said, a follow-up to everybody with the recording, with a bit more detail on the answers that we've provided. Okay, so Tony, is there anything else that maybe you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think maybe just a reiteration of the fact of how important this is. And by using platforms like this, you are just taking a huge amount of concern. You're taking a huge amount of risk away, but also for those organisations that have got multi-sites, I mean, one of the things that we get a lot of is we're actually reducing an awful amount of training burden as well. So if you think about the number of hiring managers and people across an organisation that would have to understand increasingly complex rules around right to work and DBS and all the other stuff, this is all sorted for you. So if you're not already doing it, I would suggest that you have a serious look at this, because it will not only bring you risk reduction, it will bring you operational efficiency and time, and increased time to hire, or improved, I should say, not increased, improved time to hire.
Absolutely. No, great. Thank you. And just to finish on, there's one more question, but I'm not going to answer it. I'm just going to allude to what the information that we provide. So there was somebody that was raising concerns on wrong information on education, degrees and employment history. Obviously, like I said, we'll follow up and we'll add some more information about those other services that Giant provide as well, just to give you some more answers there. But yeah, thanks everyone. And great to have everybody with us, and we'll see you on the next one, hopefully.